the talk today will be definitely worth the waiting. I'm very, very much pleased to welcome, I should say, Dr. Kristin Eggeling. Kristin Eggeling is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. And research interests are in practice theory, political identities, impression management, diplomacy, the European Union, digitalization, and fieldwork in IR. And currently, she's working on a very prestigious ERC-funded research project led by Professor Adam Nissen on the digitalization of diplomatic practices in the European Union. Kristin is a dear colleague and friend of ours, and she holds a BA in Liberal Arts and Sciences from University College Maastricht, and an MLit and PhD from our own St. Andrews. She's a MECACS graduate, and then she went on to a doctorate. So maybe Kristin will have also the chance to explore this transition in her studies later on. She had previously worked in the private and policy sector in both Doha and Brussels. Kristin, as I mentioned, is currently based at University of Copenhagen, but she remains affiliated with Uni St. Andrews as a research associate in the School of IR and MECACS. For her PhD research on nation branding, Kristin has been a visiting researcher at Nazarbayev University and Qatar University in Doha. The thesis has evolved into a book manuscript, which we'll be discussing today with the author. The book has been published by Routledge in the series Intervention series under the title Nation Branding in Practice, the Politics of Promoting Sports, Cities and Universities in Kazakhstan and Qatar. An exciting and fascinating and thought-provoking comparative study of national branding into different regions. Kristin, welcome back to St. Andrews, if virtually. It would be great to have you in person, but I'm sure there will be many more opportunities to do that. We all look forward to hearing from you, the presentation, and the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Filippo. I don't see anything on the screen in front of me, so it feels a little bit like I'm speaking into a void. But regardless, I'm super happy to speak to the members of the MECACS research group and to, of course, a lot of my former colleagues in the School of International Relations in St. Andrews. I think also I brought a couple of slides because it is, from my experience over shockingly the last year now, quite difficult actually to follow, I think, a webinar without having anything kind of to visually hold on to. But of course, even a year into the pandemic, I at least haven't learned how to use this system you use here. So there have been some issues, and I think I asked Filippo now to share a PDF version of the slides.
Yes, but I do need the PDF.
Okay, did you not get it from
No.
me in an email? Oh, that's bad news. Okay, let me just check. I send it to you at 1:45 this afternoon.
Let me just check once again.
But anyways, while you check, I can just quickly say that for the brief moment that I saw something on the screen, I saw Professor Hinnebusch, which is really great for me. And I actually wanted to open my PowerPoint presentation today with an old picture from December 2012, where there's a couple of MECACS students from back there standing in the arts lecture kind of atrium. And Professor Hinnebusch is in the photo, and I'm in the photo, and I'm very kind of in a cool way holding a bottle of beer, which I thought might have been a very nice thing to look at in the beginning, but maybe we'll get to share that picture later.
I don't seem to be able to find it, Kristin.
Okay, let me just make one last.
If you send it again, I'll be promptly uploading it.
I think I remember watching one of these seminars a few weeks ago with Diana Kudavergenova, and there was exactly the same problem.
Yes,
So
which makes
I
me wonder
apologize.
whether it's me that somehow have an impact on IT arrangements. But of course, we all know that correlation is not causation. So I definitely rule out this connection.
Okay, Filippo. Well, I've sent the slides to you again. If they come, great. If they don't come, I guess I'll just speak in this way. Okay. Well, again, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you, because the thesis I wrote as my PhD thesis, and really what has been published now as a book, which is kind of unbelievable to me because the journey seems so long, is really a product of this research center. You don't see you didn't get the email, I assume.
No.
Okay. Then I would just speak based on the notes I have in front of me. So what I thought I would talk about today would kind of briefly be probably three things. So the book, kind of tell you a little bit about its setting, the relevance of the book, the main intervention I was trying to make in the literature, the content, and kind of the core findings that I could come up with. And then I wanted to zoom in one of the case studies and show you lots of interesting photographs from Doha and Astana, and the urban development case of my case study, where I looked into how nation branding is done kind of via urban development projects, which was one of my favorite chapters in the thesis and now in the book, and which actually was one that I discussed previously in, I think, the Wednesday lunch seminar. So it would have been nice to come back to that. But then thirdly, I also wanted to talk about, if there's time towards the end, kind of the process maybe of taking a first couple of steps into an academic career, and what it kind of meant to move from being a PhD student to being a postdoc, and what I'm trying to do right now, basically to move on from that. But I'll just start by telling you a little bit about the book, and I hope at least you can see my little video on the screen. So some of you might be getting also very close to producing something like this. So that was the eventual...
Kristin,
yes?
Is your camera on, actually? Because I'm able to see you, but it may be the case that other people are not able to see you.
I think so. I see a very small...
the camera.
Yes, okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
Good.
I guess that was Matteo. Hi, Matteo.
Yep. Hi, Kristin.
Matteo, who actually examined this particular piece here. But basically, the book is a further development of my PhD thesis that I wrote at St. Andrews between 2014 and 2018. And basically, the thesis is a story about political image making. And initially, this project started through me being really interested in why do governments in both of the regions, actually, that MECACS is interested in, or back then it was MECACS, the Middle East and Central Asia. I think recently now it's been upgraded to MECACS, the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. But at least when I was doing this project, governments in both of these regions actually were investing a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of resources into kind of producing a public image for their state, often countering kind of less flattering images that were floating around the sphere of international relations. And my particular starting point for this project came out of a longer stay in Qatar, in Doha, where I started to work actually after finishing my master's degree at MECACS. And so back then, kind of, I started getting interested in basically the international, showing up all the time in the city of Doha, kind of in the story being told about the state of Qatar. And I started wondering, like, why is that the case? Why are there all these like prestigious projects being pursued, ranging from wanting to hold the World Cup in football, to inviting lots of international architects, to building really extravagant skylines, to kind of inviting international artists to not only exhibit in museums, but even build entire museums. And so I was interested in all these kinds of prestige projects being pursued in the Gulf, and also to some extent, and we'll get into that, especially in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan. And so I started out by being interested in these prestige projects. But then I went on a year of fieldwork, and eventually what then ended up being more the focus of this project was how these projects were made and how they were actually done in practice, hence now the title of the book. And I had a very funny conversation about this maybe the year before last, when I met someone at a conference and asked me about, oh, what did you write your PhD on? And I just said something like I said just now. And then this person says, oh, this is such a 21st century IR topic. Because kind of now we see lots of market logics coming into the political realm. There's a lot of talk of things like the attention economy. Everything basically is branded nowadays. So if you would see my PowerPoint presentation, you would see that it is branded with little University of Copenhagen stamps. And there's also a lot of talk about politics becoming very effective. It is all about kind of creating symbols that speak to people, that create some sort of emotions. So what I tried to do in this book was to talk to these different kinds of things that are happening via this notion of nation branding. Now on your screen in my PowerPoint presentation, you would see a little image from the streets of Astana in Kazakhstan, where there's a poster of Team Astana, the cycling team. And so these were the kinds of examples and projects that I started to look into in my thesis. Basically, how is the state imagined, how is it communicated, and how are certain ideas about it solidified and stabilized through projects like Team Astana in Kazakhstan. I conducted for this research a lot of interviews, and for example, about Team Astana, somebody told me in Kazakhstan back in 2016, well, you know, the Astana Pro Team is really like a window into our country. It is through these kinds of projects that people get to know the country and see it for what it really is. And these are the kinds of discourses that I got interested in trying to understand how supposedly very non-political things like sports, like cycling, were used to discuss and kind of establish ways to think about very political things like the nature of a state. The book very much, and the thesis too, even though MECACS, as we know, is a research center committed, I think, in a very good way to area studies and to kind of the deep contextualization and deep analysis of regional dynamics, cross-regional dynamics, and history. The thesis that I wrote was also very much an capital IR thesis, in the sense of being interested in, let's say, theory development, methodological and conceptual developments. So what I tried to do was not only do an in-depth empirical study, but also contribute something to, let's say, the conceptualization of identity in international relations through this concept of the brand. Initial inspiration for this, and I think this was one of the things that I really appreciated about being at MECACS, MECACS, is that it is very intellectually open. Like, it allows you to look to other disciplines. It is kind of anchored in IR, but from my experience, I benefited most from also looking to political geography, to sociology, to business and marketing studies, and really urban studies, and really draw on different literatures and bring ideas into debates in international relations. So kind of a very old idea that I was drawing on from the beginning was this idea that brands could be a way for us to understand identities, because brands are have kind of traditionally been indicators of value and belonging. So it really comes from this idea that you have a cow and you brand it so people know it belongs to you. But it's of course also been developed, especially in the last couple of decades, in academic disciplines close to ours, as kind of ideas that brands simplify, give value, and present self-images. So think of something, what really differentiates like a Coca-Cola from a Pepsi. It's also the entire story told around it. And if we start to translate these kinds of ideas of value, self-image, and belonging into IR, they start speaking to ideas of the nation state, of state building, of identity formation, but also questions of power and legitimation. So who has the means and the legitimate grounds to even define what it is we stand for? So what I did then is to draw on these kinds of concepts and kind of read them all through the languages and the ideas of constructivism, right? So that means that the nation is something that is practiced. It is not just given. It is not timeless. It has a history and it has kind of like a social dynamic. The same thing about identities. Identities are not ahistorical, they're malleable, they're emergent, they are made. And the same goes for questions of power and legitimacy. Legitimation is something that has to be actively performed. And what I tried to do by bringing these kinds of readings to the concept of nation branding is to really pull this concept, let's say, into more critical debates in IR. And I think it's important. I think it comes up a lot of the time that people say, what do you mean by critical? So how I looked at critical is in really like a Foucauldian sense, in the sense of not saying critique is saying that something is right or wrong, but it is more trying to understand what kind of assumptions and practices our interpretations of the world are based on. So translating this to the study of something like nation branding, the idea was to try to understand where do these oftentimes very grotesquely simplified national slogans, where do they come from? How are they, what kind of assumptions are they based on so that they seem to be legitimate to even be said out loud? And the idea to make this kind of intervention into this particular literature came from my feeling that nation branding is something, or you could call it other things, identity making, image projection are things that are discussed to some extent in international relations, but they're often kind of like dismissed as being superficial, as being vain, as being non-politically relevant. And I kind of wanted to go against that by basically not asking what the existing literature was asking, which is, it doesn't work anyways because people don't take this stuff seriously. It's just this random slogan. By kind of rethinking how we approach this kind of topic, and especially not approach it through something that can be done right or wrong or better or worse, but think about critiquing the concept in a different way by trying to understand the assumptions and practices it is based on. Next to kind of the substantial idea to drive this agenda, there was also a conceptual ambition I had in this project to kind of bring the study of practices to another area of IR than diplomatic studies. So I don't know, some of you might know, but in IR, there's all these abstract theoretical debates going on all the time. And one that has been super prevalent over the last couple of years has been the so-called practice turn, which is very advanced, especially in the study of diplomatic practices, diplomatic organizations, but actually less so in any other domain of international relations. And then finally, there was kind of a methodological ambition that I wanted to pursue with this project, was basically to study politics and international politics, let's say, away from the main corridors of power. lots of people to study politics look at what politicians do, they look at what diplomats do, what foreign ministers do. But what I wanted to look at, well, what is it that sports associations do? What is it that architects do? What is it that even universities do, which is another case study in the book, and try to basically find international relations and all its dynamics in other places than, so to say, high politics. The need in particular to look at Kazakhstan and Qatar, and I'll go into that a little bit more, is that both of these states are, first of all, not very much discussed. If you look at IR proper, of course, at MECACS, we talk about these states and these regions all the time. But otherwise, they're still pretty sidelined. And especially in the discussion of international image making and identity politics, there's often the sense about Kazakhstan, for example, that there almost exists a vacuum of knowledge. So people don't even know what this country stands for, where it even is, and interpretations of it often range kind of in between super romanticized images of these great steppe lands and wild horses, or actually a discourse of danger, that Central Asia in general is this like dangerous region where lots of not good things happen. Or I think especially in the last couple of years, many of you have probably heard about the film Borat. There's this kind of negative branding because there is like a void, there is a lack of knowledge. Quite a similar thing is actually going on in Qatar. Qatar is a very, very small state, as you all know, sitting right next to Saudi Arabia. And especially in the 1990s, when kind of the empirical time frame of my project starts, there was a lot of anxiety about not the state not being well enough known in international circles, and therefore maybe even fearing annexation from one of its bigger neighbors, because the international community basically didn't know about the country, given a short history and just a very small occupation of the world map. And then what happened in Qatar during that time, which I think then has been actually a move that was very much debated, is that the Emir of Qatar at that time decided to open the Al Jazeera channel, which probably has given the country a lot of international exposure to this day. Okay, I think a lot of this would have been much clearer to follow if you would not only see my plants in the background, but if you actually saw some sort of representation of what I was trying to bring across, but so be it. I think I will just, because I had a few graphs about how the book is structured, which doesn't make any sense if I explain them to you. So I think I'll just, for a second, go back to this idea of how I was trying to intervene in the literature, because basically the research question, the thesis and the book in the end asks is not so much the question, does nation branding work? Could it be done better? Is it done particularly well or badly in these contexts that I'm looking at? But basically to ask the question prior. So how are branding practices made? How is nation branding practiced? How is it involved in telling the story of a state? What kind of stories do they tell? And what is the political relevance of these stories? And to explore these questions, I had in the book and in the thesis 3 case studies that I looked at in these 2 empirical contexts. And this was actually, Filippo very kindly said in the beginning that this project was very interesting also for its comparative base. And one of the things that I found very liberating in this approach that I started working with, the practice approach, is that here the smallest unit of analysis, so to say, really is the practice rather than a particular actor or a particular state, for example. So eventually the comparative element in the book is not so much the comparison between the countries, but the comparison between 3 case studies along the lines of policy sectors in which nation brands are being produced. And the 3 case studies that I decided to focus on, and this is also interesting methodologically, I think, because I didn't decide to focus on them from the outset, but it really came out of kind of long-term field work in these 2 countries, where the sports sector, the urban development sector, and the higher education sector. And basically within them, through exposure in the field and through kind of being led by the dynamics of what was going on, I then focused on particular projects and ambitions within them, and I'll get to them in a second. But still, the kind of empirical context that I looked at, so Kazakhstan and Qatar, they're not random. And I think this is where maybe this audience is a lot easier to talk to than a general IR audience at times, because you will know a lot more about these countries. So on the one hand, based on the case studies that I eventually settled on, so these different practices, there was a lot of comparability there because they're basically doing the exact same thing, right? So Kazakhstan is trying to host the Olympics. Qatar is trying to host the World Cup. They have these international sports teams that they push and where they really kind of print the state name onto their jerseys. So, which is actually something that is not very common, for example, in cycling, where Team Astana, I think, has made a huge impact in promoting Kazakhstan. This is not a common thing that cycling teams cycle under the name of a state or a city in that case. But actually quite unique. They have also both pursued really these higher education projects where they're trying to invite international universities into their countries to build up flagship universities or even flagship larger education projects. And we can talk a little bit more about that, which was also very interesting for me, because during my time in the field, I was affiliated with these institutions and basically could see it from the inside out, how the international is constructed through something like a university. And then thirdly, if you maybe even right now go onto Google and type in Astana and Doha and hit on Google Images, you will actually see 2 skylines that look very similar, that have this kind of architectural language of modernity. You'll see a lot of skyscrapers of glass and steel, but then you will also see a lot of kind of idiosyncratic, interesting, weird, unique-looking buildings that are often designed by international architects, kind of in the name of the state. But next to these comparability at the practical level, so what it is that governments were investing money in to kind of push a certain narrative about the state, there's also a number of important and actually quite interesting political characteristics between comparing at least things happening within these 2 countries. And there's a chapter in the book where I discuss kind of the, let's say, almost 20th century history of both of these countries in order to come to the point of why it might be that they put a lot of time, effort, and resources into promoting themselves internationally quite aggressively. And one of the things that they both share is a colonial history, so a relatively recent independence. What I also said in the beginning, kind of compared to at least their regional environments, they could both be considered small states. So Kazakhstan is kind of sitting in between Russia and China, whereas Qatar is sitting next to its big neighbor, Saudi Arabia, which might push them to try to kind of enlarge their position through other means than territory. They are both resource-rich frontier states to, you can argue, quite different degrees. So Qatar is considered one of the most wealthiest countries in the world per capita, but Kazakhstan too has a lot of generates a lot of its economic income through selling gas. Both of them have very centralized political structures, as you will know. Both of them could be called soft authoritarian regimes, where we don't have perfect democracy, but we have actually a lot of institutions that resemble at least some sort of democratic enterprise. But both are also centered on very often paternalistic figures of national leaders. So in Qatar, that would be the emir, the king, and in Kazakhstan, it's the president. During the time that I was doing this research, it was still President Nazarbayev, who has since stepped down, but kind of remains in the, at least kind of the cloud of the Kazakhstani state by having, I guess, named himself to be the leader of the nations, and then of the nation. And then finally, both of these states can, at least to kind of the international scene, still be considered relative newcomers that, as I said in the beginning, are relatively unknown and kind of have this vacuum surrounding their identity that they're trying to fill. Good. I'm just thinking about how best to do this, given that you can't see all of the graphs that I have in the book and in this presentation, which kind of show how I then unpack the idea of the brand. Okay, maybe I'll just tell you a bit more about the case studies first, and then kind of try to give you a sense of the core argument of the book. So, as I said, I started looking at kind of projects and ambitions being pursued in these three policy sectors. And as you, most of you probably also know, 3 is often kind of this magic number in academia. It always works great if you have a triad of something. So if you're currently writing a thesis or a master's dissertation, it's always great to have something of 3. And the something 3 I had was the kind of projects being pursued to build what I then call the sports brand, the projects being pursued to build the city brand, and the projects being pursued to build the knowledge brand. And I broke this down, as I said, based on fieldwork into more particular things, because I think everybody who's tried to do qualitative research, kind of in-depth research in anything, will soon recognize that it's very difficult to look at a large number of things. So I really zoomed in, for example, in Qatar, trying to host the, about to host the 2020 World Cup, and the Team Astana and kind of the presidential sports club surrounding that in Kazakhstan in the case of the sports sector. And for example, what I then found there is that across all communication, across anything related to these projects, so that can range from the building of stadia in Qatar to a cycling race happening in Astana, to what is printed on the jerseys, to what kind of corporate social responsibility projects are funded by the state around big sporting events, that all of these things that were happening were pushing one narrative of the state. And then through actually quite classic means of discourse analysis, I tried to then unpack what are these images of the state that are being pushed. And I think in both cases, I just have to look myself quickly at my printout here, is that they were producing interpretations and simplifications of the state along political lines, ethical lines, spatial and temporal lines, which are kind of classic dynamics or classic dimensions of discourse analysis, I would say. And for example, in the spatial dimensions, it was always about positioning the state between both actually Kazakhstan and Qatar, between the East and the West, as bridges between civilizations, as these really open and inviting places. In the case of Kazakhstan, as places that favor multinational communities. In the case of Qatar, as a state that kind of favors the regionalism of the Gulf, but still can set itself apart from other places like Dubai. So very, very strong spatial identities being built through these projects. At the same time, there were very strong temporal identities being built. So in both of the contexts that I looked at and across all of these different projects, there was always a sense that we're doing this because we come from a rich cultural heritage, but we're also doing this because we want to stride on into the future. One of the things that is very interesting, and maybe it actually also exists for other states in the region that some of you might know, is that both Kazakhstan and Qatar have these national vision documents that kind of describe where the state is supposed to be headed. In Qatar, it's up to the year 2030. In Kazakhstan, it used to be up to the year 2030, but then I think back in 2012, the president said we've actually reached our 2030 goal because we've been doing so amazingly. So we're now going to push for future development until 2050. And these kind of temporal imaginations of a future not yet reached are very important in kind of stabilizing a sense of who we are in the here and now. And then finally, the other two dimensions I looked at in these narratives were the political dimension and the ethical dimension, which broadly speak to this idea of who are we as a political community and who is responsible for that community, who made the community the way it is. And here, perhaps unsurprisingly, if we think about this in the context of the soft authoritarianism that I mentioned a few minutes ago, is that all of these projects were kind of framed as being linked to the vision coming from the central government, and more particularly even coming from the president or the king. So really, if there was a new football stadium being built, it was linked to the vision of the Emir Al-Thani. If there was a cycling race held in the streets of Astana, it was praised as kind of pushing Nazarbayev's vision of making Kazakhstan into the world's sporting nation. So everything was always connected back to the central state authorities and the ideas about who legitimately runs the state. Basically, through a lot of in-depth analysis, and I do think that if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you obviously might want to look at the book. I basically end up building this three-folded argument about what is nation branding and why should we care about it as scholars of international relations. And the first step of this argument is really this idea that nation branding is not some sort of superficial selling technique that just tries to attract tourists and international capital and has all these kind of conspicuous assumptions and ambitions, but it's really a productive practice in the sense that it builds and stabilizes a certain idea about who we are and what the state stands for. In the second step of the argument, and this is very much inspired by classic constructivist idea, post-structuralist ideas, and the ideas of Foucauldian critique that I mentioned in the beginning, that these kinds of claims aren't politically neutral, that they are bound to legitimating certain interpretations of reality, that if social reality is socially constructed, there's always somebody or something doing the constructing, and as being like our job then as a critical researcher is kind of trying to figure out what the assumptions are such constructions are based on. And then finally, the last step of the argument, and I think actually so far it would be something that could be applied to probably most contexts where these kinds of image-making practices are at work. I could apply them to Denmark, where I'm sitting right now. We could apply them to the UK, which has this Great Britain narrative. But in the context that I looked at, the third step of the argument was to say that nation branding is inherently politically conservative, because even though it promotes this idea about a brand new world, a bright future, plans 30 years from now, it actually at the end tries to stabilize and reproduce and naturalize a vision of the world as it is right now, and a vision of the world as it is as linked to these particular people in power. Good. Okay, it's already 10 to 6. It's probably because we lost about 10 minutes in the beginning when I was trying to set this up. You would now see on your screen a lot of very nice images of Astana and Doha that you don't see, but maybe if you look at the presentation, if it comes to you eventually. Maybe I'll just give two brief examples just by describing it, and then we can try to wrap up, because it doesn't, I think, make so much sense to talk about this very long if you can't see the images. Actually, some of you, I can't even see who's in the call, but some of you might have been to a place like Astana, or might have been to a place like Doha. And if you have, then please, you can also, maybe once we open up the conversation, obviously come in. But I will just give you a brief example of the kinds of things I looked at to build this argument. So, for example, in Astana, there is, or maybe one step back. So both Astana and Doha, which is one of the case studies in the book, and kind of their development over the last 20 years now, and the different construction practices that went into making the city, and also the different narrative practices that are mobilized to describe them. So both cities were kind of built over the last 20 years, basically funded by resource wealth, by rentier money. Both of them, interestingly, are basically master plan cities. So rather than organically grown cities, they were designed almost on the drawing board of an architect in order to then kind of come to represent a particular dreamlike appearance, and become these kind of very strong symbols, visual symbols for what the state stands for. They're built, both of them, in a way that I think is quite foreign to at least how cities are built here, is that they're built in these little enclaves where you have a part of the city devoted to sports stadia, a part of the city devoted to universities, a part of the city devoted to residential areas. And actually they don't mix and mingle very much, which if you then read into the literature on urban development, actually reflects ideas of top-down planning, of kind of exclusionary ways of building a city, highlighting particular areas that you want to be in the focus and almost hiding other areas that you don't want to be in the focus. And then one of the things that's really fascinating in both of these cities is that a lot of kind of very particular buildings have been designed by really the creme de la creme of international architects. So if you don't know anything about this, it's not that exciting maybe, but if you look a little bit into how urban development works on a global scale, you will find very quickly that there's like 10 super famous people who take a lot of money to design and build buildings for you if you want that. A lot of them actually British. And that in both of these cities, both in Astana, and which actually has been renamed into Nur Sultan, something we can also discuss, and in Doha, really all of them are present, and all of them have been paid and commissioned by the Qatari and the Kazakhstani state to build these symbols for these new cities. And I'll just give you maybe one example from Astana. If you can also look it up on Google. It's a building by the British architect Norman Foster, which looks like a pyramid. It's a pyramid. I think if you put in Norman Foster pyramid, it probably comes up. And then I'll just give you like 2 quotes. What kind of things are then said to justify this kind of development? And so, for example, if you go to the website of the pyramid, which is in official discourse not called the pyramid, but the Palace of Peace and Reconciliation, it says the pyramid is a symbol of friendship, unity, and peace, decorated by pictures of 130 doves that symbolize the 130 nationalities living in Kazakhstan. Right? And this is an example of how these kinds of projects are then used to, in this case, for example, kind of solidify and spread this idea of politically imagining Kazakhstan as being this kind of multinational ideal type situation where harmony exists between different ethnic groups. A quote from President Nazarbayev around the same time is where he said, about this building, this construction embodies independent Kazakhstan that friendly embraces all people of all nations and practicing different religions. And so basically what I did in the study is to trace hundreds of these kinds of statements and then try to build up how they imagine, for example, the brand of Astana to then symbolize Kazakhstan in a certain way. Good.
Kristin, I very quickly interject for a second. It's 5 minutes to the hour.
Yes.
If we want to use half an hour-ish for Q&A. So it's up to you how to manage this time, but I just want to give you this heads up.
Yes, thank you so much, Filippo. I think I will just move to the last part of the presentation, and I can assume actually that it was not very easy to follow everything I've been saying now because of this format. But I think one thing that I really wanted to say in general, and that also is in the book probably even more than the thesis, because when you move from writing a thesis where you try to please your examiners to writing a book where you know you can be a bit more bold in what it is you say, is that one of the things I really wanted to make transparent in the book is that the arguments that are presented there and the research I conducted was really this emergent process, right? I didn't go into the PhD thinking I was going to do exactly this and I was going to find exactly this, but really how the project kind of assembled itself in the process, which I think is especially interesting to read and hear about for people maybe currently writing on a dissertation. So I have this section in the book that I might even have shared with some of you on kind of the process of researching and writing this book, where really there's a lot of sentences kind of underlining my own positionality. There's even a little discussion about what it means to come from a place like St. Andrews and going into field work, how that positions you, what are the benefits of that, what are maybe the drawbacks of that, but even though the latter were not very pronounced in my case at least. But I think that there are also a lot of very interesting conversations for us to be had about how we assemble such a project, maybe especially if it is the first one. Maybe someone like Professor Hinnebusch, who's written many, many books, can just more or less set out in a project and know more or less where he's going to sail. But I think especially in the early years of being an academic, this can still be quite a daunting task. And then maybe finally, I just want to close on saying that, and Filippo introduced me so kindly in the beginning, I've since finishing this project moved a little bit away from the Middle East and Central Asia, but actually not away from any of the conceptual, methodological, and more theoretical discussions in the book. And maybe in this forum, of course, people are also very interested in the regions, and so am I, and continue to be. But I just want to say that this project and the fieldwork and really getting to know regions from the inside out and learning how to apply different broader discussions in international relations really set me up in a very good way to then go deeper into a more general, let's say, research career in this discipline, which might be something, we could discuss maybe to what extent actually this is linked to studying particular regions of the world. But I think, Filippo, why don't we take a few minutes break and then come back and basically we can talk about anything. I can try to give you a bit more of a sense of anything in the book or anything more related to transforming the thesis into the book, or yes.
Absolutely. Kristin, thank you so very much. I actually want to use this couple of minutes of break to praise actually both you and the presentation you've just delivered, which I found extremely thought-provoking, fascinating, and very personal in the sense that it was very, very difficult to disentangle your research topic, your way of doing research, and your persona, right? The person that actually carries out these methodological and research-related practices, pun, of course, intended. You covered a lot of very, very insightful aspects of your research and the disciplines we engage with, ranging from comparative regionalism to IR theory and methodology and methods. You spanned from, there were echoes in your presentation of Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, and then you moved at the intersection between IR, area studies, and the everyday, which is very much present in the way you conducted fieldwork. You touched, if implicitly, on the very fine-grained analytical challenges that you were confronted with of distinguishing what is nation branding and how this is different from nation building and soft power, for example, one of the most used and abused terms in diplomatic and IR studies contemporarily. I like very much how you emphasized, even if you didn't mention these terms, both agency and structure, right? You mentioned on the one hand the agency of these people and elites to push these projects that very much speak teleologically to the development of the identity of the nations, but at the same time you spoke of conservatism, right? So how actually this reinforces of structures of meanings and behaviors that ossify and crystallize the meaning of the political and of the nation. I love the way you discussed the challenges and the opportunities of fieldwork. And I believe this made all of us a little bit nostalgic of traveling and of being somewhere else. But it was a good nostalgia, the one you elicited. So thanks for that. I also loved how you somehow delved into, you started from a very, very, let's say, top-down approach in the sense that you want to look at these macro patterns of nation branding, looking at these two different case studies. But then, and this is one of the virtues, right, of the practice approach, you zoom in, right, from the forest to the trees. And in fact, you look at the leaves and the insects on the leaves, not just to the trees. So I like how in your research, you navigate very swiftly and harmonically through different levels of analysis. And I say this also because I had the benefits when you were in St. Andrews also to go through your PhD thesis. So I know in a way what is behind your work. So I have my own questions and comments, but at the same time, I believe that we should be grateful to our audience for being so patient in waiting for us and listening to you. So I now open the floor for any questions or comment or point that any of you want to raise. Thank you once again for being with us, and the floor is open for everyone from the audience to come forward. And please don't be shy. I should add that given the technical difficulties today, it may well be the case that it's one of those days in which the hand up icon doesn't work on my screen. So if you have your hand up and I don't call you out, please do feel free to absolutely overrule my position as chair and just pose your question.
I don't see anything, so.
Aliyah has her hand up.
Okay.
Yeah,
yes, I do.
So,
Alia, and it's a shame that Kristin cannot see me, but I see you and welcome, and it's a pleasure to see you. I have two questions, and I think thank you so much for the presentation, and it's great to see the final work out there. You know, we were there in the trenches of the PhD, and we made it, and it's fantastic to see the final work. I have a question about, and it's both towards the cases, but also generally, more conceptually about. It dawned on me that while you were presenting that, you know, both Qatar and Kazakhstan are trying to belong in this wider club of international states. So going a little bit beyond their own region and kind of presented at this wider world global scale. And I don't know whether you dealt in this in the book or across your research, like what does it say about states? You know, is it a case of small states trying to be bigger than they are through these projects of nation branding? Or does that sense of belonging to an international state also says something about these countries that you talk about? And the second question I have is mostly about the relation of fieldwork and post-book production. When you talk to people on the ground about your research, what kind of impression does it make on them? Do they reflect on what you're saying about you know, the issues that you're studying? Do they start thinking and self-reflecting about the issues of nationality, identity, nation branding? Does your research make an impact on them? And then vice versa, does it come back to you and saying like, oh yeah, after thinking about this, I actually think, you know, you should write about this and this and this. Oh yeah, thank you.
Excellent, Alia. Thanks so much for what is definitely a thought-provoking question, to say the least. Kristin, maybe we should tackle this question immediately, given that it touches on many things, and then we continue with gathering questions. There is already one from Fiona in the chat, so you can start addressing these, and then I will report to you Fiona's question.
Okay, thanks so much. And Aliyah, I saw you very briefly and then you disappeared, but great to see you. I think both excellent questions. The first one, the question of belonging, and what does it mean to kind of try to, let's say, almost build what you are nationally by connecting it to what you are internationally. I think it's actually something that's probably happening to lesser extent everywhere and in all kinds of contexts. But I think in both of the contexts that I looked at, there was a very interesting dynamic for both of these states in relation to how they imagined themselves vis-a-vis the regions they were in, and actually vis-a-vis the region of Asia. And there is a discussion of that in the book. But for example, and I know that a lot of you in this, I was going to say Zoom room, it's not a Zoom room, but work on, for example, the Eurasian Union and kind of this idea of Eurasia. And this is basically one of the dominant tropes that Kazakhstan imagines itself in relation to Asia. It's kind of this imagination of Eurasia, which pulls the state a bit away from this cluster of states that it would maybe primarily be associated with just by the very name it carries. In the time when I was doing this research, there was also a debate in Kazakhstan, and Aliyah knows obviously much more, but that Kazakhstan, and this debate also preceded this particular time frame, was even considering renaming itself to kind of drop the stan at the end, which in the Persian languages just means land or country, right? But partly to disassociate itself from, let's say, this region of the other stans. And here I think this particular imagination of Asia as Eurasia played an important role for that. A similar thing in imagining itself in relation to a particular version of Asia was actually happening in the Gulf. I think this has actually died down again, but when I started out this work, there was this ambition by different countries in the Gulf to no longer be associated as belonging to the Middle East, but as belonging to what they were trying to brand as Western Asia, West Asia. Because I think there was a bit of the sense, similar to in the Central Asian case, to get away from the stigmatized, the very problematized notion of being a Middle Eastern state. So different kinds of narrative ideas, and then different kinds of projects and ambitions linked to, for example, belonging to Asia were happening in both of these. And the question of fieldwork and reflexivity and how you go and do this kind of work is super excellent. And I think there's two ways of answering this. The first one is really to say that when I conducted interviews, say, with the head of a sports academy, I didn't ask them about whether they thought they were contributing to, let's say, the international brand of the country. What I asked them about was really much more explorative. It was really much more on the ethnographic side of all of the methods, kind of going into asking open-ended questions. What is it that you're doing here? How would you explain your job? What are the main ambitions? Why are you hosting this event? Like really kind of be very explorative. And through this entire process, very much even the conceptual debate in the project about framing it as nation branding emerged through that. This question about what happens when we interview people, do we trigger a reflexive assessment in them, is, I would 100% say, true. But I would also say there's probably no way around that, and we should just basically account for that in the ways how we write our works up in the end. Okay, I could talk about this for a very long time, but I see a few other little hand icons, so.
Thanks, Kristin. You dealt with questions very, very well and timely. Some of your answers may actually also help us transition to Fiona's question. And then I see Hamid hands up. So I will address Fiona's question first, and then Hamid, I'll give you the floor. So Fiona has a two-pronged question. The first one is, do you have a sense that these two countries either used other states as a model for branding or have now become models for others? And the second question is, yet again, about fieldwork, is given the significance of fieldwork and given where we are nowadays, what would be different with respect to your projects in times like those we're living in nowadays? What elements could be done virtually, for example? So these are Fiona's question. Thank you, Fiona, for asking. And then Hamid, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Filippo, and thank you all. Thank you, Tini, for the presentation and the book. So it's piggybacking on the first question that Fiona just posed. How much of your work, your interviews, the experience you have had in both Qatar and Kazakhstan, you have seen a resemblance from other cities, other cases, particularly Dubai? I mean, Dubai started this early on. They started also some sort of branding to themselves, mostly in the economic investment space, and then added on other pieces. And there has been always the competition among the Gulf states on who is attracting more, who is more unique, who is, getting the acceptance of the West in terms of money, in terms of opportunities, and so on and so forth. So to what extent you have seen these developmental plans and projects in the cases that you have looked at coming from elsewhere and not necessarily a unique way of looking at it? So that's number one. Number two, to what extent also these cases can be looked at in other experiences, like all of these cases in the Gulf or Kazakhstan or other oil-rich or other rich countries, they have the funding to do that. But other countries that don't have that funding, they share one common thing, which is more of an authoritarian, non-democratic approaches. So we have Egypt as a case right now, building and expanding in the desert a new administrative capital. It wants to have the highest tower in Africa. It wants to do this, the biggest, the widest. All of these notions of trying to build a narrative that represents your new state or new regime argument, and so on and so forth. So also, to what extent we can link that type of conversation method framework to go beyond the oil-rich or the rich countries to other authoritarian, other centralized controlled states that might not have the money, but they are finding ways to kind of brand themselves as the, the developer and what it's going to bring to the nation. So again, I'm sorry if these are more ramblings than anything, but it's a matter of like looking beyond just the connection of the wealth and the ability to do that vis-a-vis others that are aspiring to this type of shiny branding, but don't have it necessarily and are doing it. Thank you.
Thanks much, Ahmed. Excellent questions. And especially the first one made me think that one of the first instances of nation branding in Central Asia was actually in the mid-1990s with Kyrgyzstan, right? Putting itself as the Switzerland of Central Asia while joining the WTO, IMF, and opening up to FDI coming from the West and other developed economies. So very interesting question, Ahmed. Thank you. Filippo is also on the list of people who are willing to pose a question. So perhaps we can go to him as well, and then we can leave the floor to you, Kristin. So sure. Filippo, thank you.
Thank you, Filippo. Thank you so much, Kristin, for the fascinating presentation. I have one two-folded question. So this branding, of course, inherently targets different actors, both domestically and internationally. So my question to you is whether during your research you found major incongruencies on how the message that the state is trying to portray differs between these different actors and social conglomerates, we can say, internationally and domestically especially in Kazakhstan. And also given the fact that both Kazakhstan and Qatar are two countries that develop a quite multi-vectorial foreign policy, to use this term, where this project of branding, even if we think perhaps at big infrastructure projects like Horgos in the border between China and Kazakhstan, how does this affect Kazakhstani and Qatari foreign policy? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Kristin, it's all yours.
Great, thanks so much. Having this discussion makes me miss the MECACS community at St. Andrews. Not that I don't have a nice community of colleagues right now, but I certainly also had one in the past, and I hope we can see each other again soon in the post-pandemic world. Okay. Some questions about methods, some questions about scope, some questions about the traveling possibilities of the argument. I think all of them are super valid. Maybe I'll just work myself backwards from what we've just heard from all of you. Super interesting, I think, that both Filippos, now there's two Filippos in St. Andrews, mention also, of course, that a lot of these let's say we can call them branding, we can call them positioning, we can call them role-seeking things that are also happening in the more traditional foreign policy activities, right? So Kyrgyzstan claiming to be the Switzerland of Central Asia and joining all of the international treaties and institutions and organizations, or Kazakhstan also pursuing this policy of multi-vectorism, being also a mediator in different conflicts. I think in Astana, we've also seen peace talks about Syria, right? There's also a lot of positioning in this field of high politics, so to say. These are equally important. I don't want to say more important, because part of the argument of my project overall, and actually some of the work I've been doing since, is that we can also see international relations and politics and all these places that seem to be so unpolitical, or that even pretend to be unpolitical, which I think is still something where international relations research can actually push a lot further. The second question, the first question actually that Filippo asked was about who is targeted in this branding and what are the different audiences, and does the narrative kind of change? Here I think I have to make a certain disclaimer about the scope of an academic argument, and the scope of the argument that I was trying to make in this project was very much about how is the community to the international audience, or even an imagined international audience. This partly had something to do with the languages of the sources that I looked at were primarily English, based on my own inabilities to speak regional languages to the extent of conducting research in, and also just to make a project like a PhD and a single research project to some extent manageable. So I'm actually sure that investigating in more detail, let's see how for example, messages differ according to the language would be a super interesting next step to take for this. But where I really focused on was kind of the one, trying to figure out what the one narrative was that was being pushed predominantly to the international level. And maybe linked to this, we can try to go to what Ahmed was saying about this question that obviously other types of regimes, not only rich resource rentier states, use different kinds of superlatives, different kinds of descriptions of what they are the world's best in how they position themselves. And for example, actually this example of Egypt and this new administrative city being built outside of Cairo is actually a very interesting example here. Similar projects being pursued in lots of the regional states at the moment as we speak. And maybe you, a little bit back in my presentation, I was talking about which parts of the argument would apply to, let's say, other regions in the world, and maybe the practice more general, and which way really were connected to the empirical context that I looked at. And there I said that really the third step, this like argument of saying, okay, this is linked to the conservation of the regime, it's a politically conservative thing that's happening here. So that claim you can only make if you have in-depth knowledge about a particular setting. But what I would definitely at least expect from the research I've been doing on this practice is that the first two parts of the argument, so this idea of being productive of a certain type of way of thinking about the state, and of that production being linked to some political interests, that is definitely the part of the argument that travels along the lines of also very established ideas in international relations theory. I think that the first question Ahmed asked about the difference between, for example, a place like Doha and Dubai, this was actually one of the things I think that organically emerged from me doing this work without ever talking about it. And there was a lot of, I just did a little word search while you were asking the question, at least 16 instances in the book where people actually told me, and this is how we're not like Dubai, and this is how we're not like Dubai. But also, and then I think if you go very deep into discourse analysis, you can probably detect some sort of narrative mechanism where always differentiating yourself from another actually probably draws that one closer to you almost involuntarily, but something else maybe to be explored. I think I just want to pick up lastly, and then we can see if we have more time, or if any of you are super unsatisfied with your answer, we can come back. Is the second question from Fiona, which is the question about how do we do this work and when we can't travel? Because of course my research for this project was based on more than a year of fieldwork, in-person fieldwork, traveling around the world, and being on site, so to say. I think it makes total sense why this question comes up now, and I'll talk about this in a second. But actually also before the pandemic, one of my colleagues now at Copenhagen asked me, Kristin, yes, I think what a great project, but could you maybe also, when you write it into a book now, include a section in your methods explanation where you tell us how we can do this research from afar? Because a lot of students are interested in this kind of thing, but they simply can't go on a year of fieldwork, or they can't even travel at all, but they have maybe access to the library and to their computers. So in the book, and which really comes in handy now because this was written before the outbreak of the corona pandemic, there are these sections about how to do this research via documents, how we can also do practice theoretical research via documents, how we can do it to some extent via remote interviews, but also how we can do it by looking at a website and promotional materials and different kinds of proxies. They can be something like YouTube videos or all kinds of, let's say, data, so to say, we can access from afar. And then still kind of approach them through, let's say, a more than textual analysis by also asking how are they connected to different actors, when are they coming up, how are they connected to each other, are they shared a lot, do they circulate, does no one ever look at them, right? How can we look at more than the context of what it is they're saying? But I'm also very interested in this debate of kind of doing remote, we can call it remote fieldwork or remote ethnography. And actually, maybe you have a different seminar on this kind of topic at some point, because that's basically also what I've been trying to do over the past year for the current research project I work on. And I'm trying to publish a paper on this. So I think it would be very interesting to have a deeper discussion maybe at some point on that.
Absolutely. Sorry, is anyone coming back?
Filippo, if I can just interject quickly. Yeah. Again, on that point on virtual methods, virtual research methods, I work for the American Political Science Association based in DC. I'm also a former graduate of St. Andrews. And we're currently actually with my colleagues, and I manage the Middle East North Africa project. We're trying to come up with a seminar series of 3 weeks, probably starting sometime in April, on virtual research methods. It's basically trying to bring in a group of early career scholars, maybe PhD students or even junior faculty who are interested in kind of coming together to discuss some of their challenges or adjustments that they have to go to do to be able to continue the research, whether writing their PhDs or any other form of research, utilizing some of these virtual methods. And I think that could be of an interest to anyone who's working along those lines. Maybe our focus is mostly people who are working on the MENA region in general, but I think it can be extended to anyone who's interested. And I'd be happy to share once we have a formal or formalized plan with MECACS and other colleagues at St. Andrews as well.
Sounds fantastic, Ahmed. Thanks so much for sharing this opportunity with us. That's very generous of you. And Kristin, I just wanted to comment on how well, in my opinion, you have been analyzing throughout this almost hour and a half the challenges of addressing your positionality while doing fieldwork and the complexities of doing fieldwork. That fieldwork is not just an exotic activity that you spend in airport lounges waiting for the next connection flight and then taking pictures and selfies, but is actually a very, very solid and rigorous framework of research with specific methods, methodologies, and research steps that the researchers has to undertake if the project is to be implemented properly. So I very much also welcome how you connected your personal experience to broader research related challenges. That was very, very kind of you. We have 2 minutes left. So unless there are any final questions or comments.
Can I go with the final question, Filippo?
Yeah,
all right.
okay.
Super quick. I'm conscious of the time. Actually, I'm gonna put the camera on so I see all of you guys. You see me as well. Okay, good to see you all. So the case study very quickly that comes into mind when you mention the cycling in Astana is obviously the Israeli Startup Nation project, right? Because Israel has done something quite similar. They have a team, the cycling team. They've also hosted the Giro d'Italia the first 3 days in 2017. That case, though, however, has got a quite clear political connotation, and there is a sort of almost orientalist, I would say, undertone that associates cycling with modernity and with the state of Israel. Now, obviously, there is the role of Sylvan Adams, which is like massive cyclist fan, who is like multimillionaire. This kind of private enterprise as well. I was wondering whether in the case of Kazakhstan, there is any association with this sort of idea of cycling as a modern sport or sport in general. I mean, in the case of Israel, I think there's a quite strong association with kind of the idea of cycling as a European sport, kind of, not what Arabs do essentially. And I've looked at some declaration and documents that best essentially refer to that. So is there anything similar there? And maybe we should talk about this in the future if we want to write a paper together. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesco. Thank you so much. I love writing papers together with people, so always open to ideas here. But I think, so I don't know the case of Israel very well, but I think at least in the case of Team Astana, it goes even deeper. And I think there's 2 things we could say here. On the one hand, that it ended up being cycling that became like, actually as one of my interviews where I quote in the thesis in the book say, is like the crown jewel of what Kazakhstani sporting stands for. Was not really a coincidence, but it was at least partially a coincidence because they had the cyclist Alexander Vinokurov, who won the Olympics and then just got really, really, really famous. And then it was almost like the formation of the club and the team was capitalizing on the fame of this person who then really was made into this national hero, not only a national sporting hero, but really a national hero. So to some extent, it was an element of chance, I think, or of the talent of that particular individual. And the second thing, also, when you look at, for example, how the official discourse kind of speaks about cycling, it's even more generalized, I think, into this idea of the value of having like a healthy population and what in general the social value of good health and ability to move and these kinds of things are, and how important that is for the entirety of the population. And I'm not a historian of the Soviet Union, but I think there's also a lot of ideas of that going really back to ideas developed over the 20th century of like having popular sports and the Soviet Union and its ideals also of being, let's say, bodily fit and what that means for the health of the individual citizen and the health of the nation. So I think we can do both a comparative study with Israel and a historical study into what it means maybe in the region. I think I also see race.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Excellent. So co-author paper sorted. Ray, you are the next one, although I do assume that everyone is aware that we are beyond the time allotted to this event. So, Ray, you have the honor of closing the event, if you wish. You have the last word.
Yes, I just wanted to say how lovely it is to see you, Kristin, and it was a marvelous presentation. I think you are really a splendid advertisement for MECACS. Not only because of your success as a scholar, but the way you are comparing across the regions, which of course is our niche. And I would really love to hear something about whether your research exposed some interesting similarities, but also differences between the region. But I know, alas, we're out of time, so possibly another time we can do that. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ray. And thank you also for making my duty of bringing this talk to a closure much easier, because I cannot do anything but seconding Ray's word. It was a fantastic presentation, Kristin, and you managed to overcome the technical difficulties.
Yes, I sincerely apologize. Even a year into this, I apparently haven't figured it out.
It was, apologies, it was absolutely thought-provoking, and I think it gave all of us much food for thought for how we study the region or regions, how we engage in comparison and comparative research, and how we do research, most importantly. We do hope to have you back at some point in person. And until then, take care, stay safe, and very best of luck with all your exciting projects. Once again, on behalf of MECACS and St. Andrews, all our gratitude for sharing your time today with us. And thank you so much for sharing your research and your experiences. So join me in a virtual round of applause for Kristin. And
thank you.
Thank you again.